When she walked, the earth didn't just listen, it moved out of her way. When she dreamed, it wasn't just fantasy, it was instruction. Harriet Tubman, conductor of the Underground Railroad, was many things: spy, soldier, abolitionist, but to her people she was more: a conjure woman, a root worker, and a vessel for power older than slavery, older than America even. This is the Legends of Hoodoo, and this is episode 1, Conjurer of the Railroad. Long before Harriet Tubman ever laid a hand on the rails of the Underground Railroad, she was immersed in the deep spiritual technologies of Hoodoo. Born Araminta Ross, affectionately known as Minty, in March of 1822 to parents Harriet Ritt Green Ross and Benjamin Ross, she was one of 9 children. The Ross family lived under the brutal code of chattel slavery in Dorchester County, Maryland, where people were treated as property and families were routinely torn apart. Although Benjamin Ross was a free man, the children took their mother's status, enslaved. That legal designation determined Harriet's fate. And at this point in the video, we're already only one paragraph into my script, and we're already seeing where in Maryland there was slavery. And Maryland is classified in the northeastern part of the United States, which already tears apart this notion that there was no slavery in the North. But the story of Benjamin Ross in relation to his family is also important because on TikTok and on social media, there's this notion that if slavery didn't affect black men, then we would still have slavery. Well, that's clearly nonsense when you look at the family of Harriet Tubman, because her father was a free man, and yet he was still a slave in a way. Because if you go to the average man, not just black man, but any man, and you enslave his wife and his children, then are you really free? And if Benjamin Ross didn't care about his family, then why was the overseer and the slave master moving his children around so that he could not intervene should the slave master or the overseer abuses his children? And what a lot of people on TikTok don't seem to realize is that the reason why the overseer and the slave master would go out of their way to do this to Benjamin Ross and his family was designed to make Benjamin Ross aware that while on paper he's free, he's still a slave. And so freedom was a double-edged sword, because while you were free, that didn't mean that your mama, your daddy, your brother, your sister, your children, or your wife was free. And common sense should tell someone that one of the first tactics that people use to extort money out of someone is to go after their children, no matter the skin color. And there have been fathers throughout history who have paid hefty ransoms to protect their children. And so while Benjamin Ross was free, he was still a slave. And what further proves this whole idea that black men would actually allow slavery to continue to be absolute nonsense is the fact that black men such as Benjamin Ross were partially responsible for the Underground Railroad. And in fact, if black men were so abusive towards black women and didn't care about black women, then please explain Benjamin Ross purchasing his wife's freedom and then going on to free a bunch of slaves and then free a lot of his own children. And so I know it's a big detour in a story about Harriet Tubman to discuss her father, but I use these opportunities to dispel anti-black nonsense, and that's even if the anti-black nonsense is coming out of the mouth of a black person, which is absurd because without black men such as Benjamin Ross, they might still be slaves. But back to our hero. The enslaver of the Ross family was Edward Broadus, and he made sure to destabilize family structures because that was the main method of control for people like Harriet Tubman and her family. He assigned work to split the Ross family apart, separating Benjamin from Ritt and the children. Tubman, her mother, and siblings were moved to another Broadus-controlled farm in Bucktown, Maryland. At just 6 years old, Tubman was rented out to nearby overseers to provide childcare, and that was a common practice in the United States. And that arrangement where she was being rented out to other people for childcare, even though she was a child herself at just 6 years old, well, that stripped away the parental connection that Harriet Tubman was supposed to have with her own parents, and all compensation that she was given for all the childcare that she was given at just 6 years old was given to Edward Broadus for his own use. And it's not like she was allowed to work in peace. No, it was forced labor, and if she didn't didn't do what he told her to do, or if she were to disobey the families that she was babysitting for, she would either be beaten or starved, and that sort of treatment was happening away from her family so that they could not intervene. This was more than just physical cruelty. No, it was an attack on identity, security, and the psychological foundations of childhood. And if you want to know what creates the hardcore radical, the hardcore rebel that Harriet Tubman was, well, you gotta understand that her childhood was defined by years of trauma. Constant fears, separation, and abuse deeply affected Harriet Tubman and her mental and emotional landscape. Developmental psychology shows that early trauma, especially persistent, be it emotional neglect or physical violence, can permanently alter the nervous system. But in Tubman's case, it forged something remarkable, an intense internal world. She began to see visions and dreams as meaningful, perhaps as a way to survive an outward world so saturated in cruelty. These early experiences, loss, pain, injustice, would later translate into the resolve and spiritual clarity that shaped her path as a freedom fighter and also as a mystic. Her life changed forever at just the age of 13. She witnessed someone who was going to be recaptured into slavery, and so she tried to shield that person. Because she tried to protect that person, the overseer threw a 2-pound iron weight at both Harriet Tubman and the fugitive, and it hit Harriet Tubman in the head. And there was a serious lack of medical care. The only medical care that Harriet Tubman received was her mother's root work. And there was some evidence that was found in the childhood home of Harriet Tubman, and also even the overseer's home, that would point to some hoodoo being utilized. And many suspect that hoodoo was used to try to remedy the injury that Harriet Tubman received. But without advanced medical care, there wasn't much a root worker or even a conjure doctor could do. However, in hoodoo, if you give respect and honor to your ancestors, and also if you behave in a way that is considered honorable, then sometimes even a disability or an injury can become a very important and powerful spiritual tool. And so after the injury and during recovery, Harriet Tubman began to experience chronic headaches, hypersomnia, and also intense visions that came upon her in a waking sleep. And these were seizures, and so these seizures are now known as narcolepsy, but Harriet Tubman called them sleeping spells. And she didn't see them as medical episodes. No, she saw them as divine messages, because she saw these dreams and these visions as a way into the spirit realm, or as a way of receiving messages from the ancestors. And in hoodoo and other spiritual practices, you will find this martyrdom, or this requirement for sacrifice or paying a cost to receive power. Because understand this, hoodoo came as a creation from enslaved people as a way of providing themselves medical care, finding food when slave masters wouldn't feed you, and also keeping important spiritual and cultural practice all wrapped into one that stresses ancestral praise so that you never forget who was lost in chains. And so that sort of belief system lends itself to seeing great injury while defending another person who is enslaved as sacred. In other words, Harriet Tubman's sacrifice to protect another person who was enslaved just like her was the partial gateway into her spiritual power. These sleeping spells allow her to achieve altered states of consciousness, and through these altered states of consciousness, she could foresee danger, escape routes, and also she could be led by the spirits themselves. And despite the injuries, she was forced to go back into the fields and work almost immediately. But if you thought that Harriet Tubman just returned back as the same slave girl, well, it turns out that injury might have awoken something, because one of her first acts as a tactical hoodoo conjure woman was negotiating with an enslaver to choose her own work assignments on the condition that she paid him a fee. Through this arrangement that the enslaver thought was a great deal, Harriet Tubman began taking up work in timber yards and also marshland fields. And it was there where she started learning about different plants, different types of wood, how to use an axe, and also talking with other enslaved people and sharing and exchanging knowledge. And so at this point, you're already seeing where Harriet Tubman's mother utilized hoodoo to help her head injury, and now you're seeing Harriet Tubman behaving in a way that I described a hoodoo practitioner to be in the first place. They're very tactical, and the way that she's moving and negotiating now, you're gonna notice that she's behaving like someone who is a prisoner of war. Chapter 2, Piercing the Veil. As we discussed in Chapter 1, Harriet Tubman was allowed to pick her own work assignments, and she selected the timber yards and also the marshland fields. And there were several reasons why she selected those jobs. And one of those reasons was to reconnect with her father, Benjamin Ross. And they reconnected and established a bond that was nearly impossible to establish before, given the fact that Harriet Tubman and her family were moved around so that her father, who was a free slave, could not assist them. But while working at those various job assignments, she was once again a tactical hoodoo conjure woman, so she was learning all kinds of skills. For example, Harriet Tubman met up with black sailors and also abolitionists who just so happened to have come through those marsh fields and also sometimes the timber yards. And those black sailors were informants who would spread around coded knowledge of terrain and also abolitionist networks. Harriet Tubman's knowledge of the marsh fields of the eastern shore and also the woods gave her a unique advantage that no map out there could match. In 1844, Harriet Tubman married John Tubman and then changed her name from Araminta to Harriet, and this was most likely to honor her mother. But just because she found love, that did not mean that she found freedom, because she heard that her enslaver was preparing to sell more slaves, and she knew what that meant, because you see, sale wasn't just about relocation. Oh no, it often meant permanent separation, torture, or worse. And for about 5 years, she heard these rumors, and in 1849, her enslaver passed away, but her fears of being sold or her family being sold didn't pass away with the enslaver. And now we're going to discuss the supernatural and Harriet Tubman's visions, because for the first time, we really see these visions come into play to protect her. While she was having a narcoleptic episode, she had a vision, likely from an ancestor, wanting her to leave and try to escape. And so her and her brothers left the plantation in a daring escape. However, her brothers, who began the journey with her, decided to turn back when they heard there was a reward for their capture. But Harriet Tubman pressed on. And seeing her brothers go back had to be traumatic for her, because she understood that even if they turned themselves in, they were still likely to be punished. And on top of that, she wanted to lead them to freedom, and yet Harriet Tubman would only find freedom for herself, as she would follow the North Star and cross the Mason-Dixon line into Pennsylvania. But the way that she did this was very interesting, and that was the supernatural part that I alluded to, because on that journey towards Pennsylvania, she was guided by her dreams and also the ancestors and what we believe to be earth spirits. And so in hoodoo, one of the reasons why it is a closed practice is specifically because of our power source. And so let me explain magic the exact same way that I would explain starting a fire. You see, there's many ways to start a fire. You have electrical fires, you have a fire that starts by burning, a fire that can start by lightning, a fire that can start by a firearm going off, or constant friction, or any other way to start a fire. And the whole point is that there's many ways to start a fire. However, the source is what I'm going to focus on here. Hoodoo is a magical practice in which the source of the magic is the ancestral energy itself. Whereas in something like voodoo, well, you see, voodoo has a pantheon of deities called the Luau. And so if you want guidance or a certain spell to be done or a certain task, you can pray to the Luau within voodoo. However, within hoodoo, the source of the power is the ancestors, the memories, the pain, the suffering, and their hopes for the future that have materialized into magic and strength for the descendants of those people. In hoodoo, we are taught that respect towards your ancestral lineage, honorable living, and charitability are the strongest sources of our magic. And so Harriet Tubman's sacrifice to protect another enslaved person and then her getting injured as a result of that was the awakening that she needed. Because while it's not required that we engage in martyrdom in hoodoo, anyone who does, well, you see what they become. And since Harriet Tubman's specific sacrifice would have never been a thing had she had the ability to predict the future, well, that was the power that she was given. Because in hoodoo, you see, the empowerment that any individual freedman is given will almost always be designed to prevent the very thing that hurt that freedman in the first place. And so with that said, Harriet Tubman was able to get herself to Pennsylvania by using visions from the ancestors. And you may be wondering, wondering, how does that work? Well, once again, we're going to be discussing a little bit of the supernatural, so bear with me. In magic, you have many different base elements, and depending on where you go across the planet, the main or base element will differ. But in Hoodoo, the base element is earth, basically rocks, roots, plants, fungal matter. And when our ancestors pass away, their bodies become one with the earth. And like any other body, they provide nourishment for plants and fungal matter, mushrooms basically. And those plants become pollinated by bees and other insects or even birds. And so our ancestors, through the process of nature or the circle of life, are spread out all across these lands. And so if Harriet Tubman could in fact pierce the veil between the living world and the spiritual world, then the method in which the ancestors transferred that message was through the dirt, through the roots, through the fungal networks, through the ground itself. And so while we can work with other types of magic, water magic, fire magic, doesn't matter, the basis of all of those types of magic is the earth. And you will notice this theme throughout the story of Harriet Tubman, whereas it is through the earth itself that Harriet appears to avoid danger or certain demise. Chapter 3: Betrayal, Loss, and Transformation. Harriet Tubman's journey towards freedom was not only physically treacherous, but emotionally harrowing. In 1844, she married John Tubman, a free man once again. Their marriage marked a significant shift in her identity. She changed her name from Araminta Minty Ross to Harriet Tubman, and once again that was likely to honor her mother. And I mention this again because there are some people on social media suggesting that Harriet Tubman is not a real person simply because she changed her name. And what many people don't realize is that it was a common practice for enslaved people to change their names to symbolize a new beginning. However, the promise of marriage and the relative stability that it brought were swiftly overshadowed by betrayal. When Harriet Tubman first envisioned escaping to freedom, John Tubman did not offer his support. Instead, he threatened to snitch on her. This betrayal was profoundly wounding, not only because of the personal betrayal, but also because John represented the tenuous hope of freedom within the boundaries of her enslavement. To Harriet, this betrayal revealed how even intimate relationships could be weaponized by the system of slavery and white supremacy. After escaping alone to Pennsylvania, Harriet bravely returned to Maryland, driven by love and hope, intending to bring John Tubman back with her. Upon returning, she discovered he had remarried and was indifferent to her quest for freedom. This emotional blow was compounded later when John Tubman met his own tragic fate. He was murdered, and yet in a cruel twist of justice indicative of the racial prejudices of the time, an all-white jury acquitted his killer. Some considered this outcome poetic justice for his earlier portrayal of Harriet Tubman, but it only highlights the persistent violence and injustice that Black Americans endured back then and still endure even now. Because while I would say that it was poetic justice what happened to John Tubman, I cannot ignore the fact that it appears he did not receive justice and that this was only a reflection of the times. But the painful dissolution of her marriage was a turning point. She resolved never again to let personal ties compromise her mission. This emotional betrayal, compounded by societal injustice, deepened her resolve and clarified her path. The heartache transformed her, sharpening her spiritual insight and intensifying her connection to Hoodoo and her ancestral traditions. She learned to harness emotional pain as a tool of spiritual resilience. Her work with the Underground Railroad was perilous and demanding. Harriet repeatedly risked capture and death to lead enslaved people to freedom. The Underground Railroad was not a literal railroad, but a network of secret routes and safe houses operated by abolitionists and allies. It required meticulous planning, coded language, and clandestine communication. Harriet, guided by her profound visions and intuitive wisdom, navigated these dangerous routes skillfully. Astrology and celestial navigation played crucial roles, with Hoodoo practitioners often consulting the moon, stars, and other astrological phenomena to determine the safest times to travel. Harriet relied on these ancient techniques, along with spiritual intuition honed through conjure practices, to lead escaping slaves safely. Not every rescue went smoothly. Some enslaved people paralyzed by fear or uncertainty, considered turning back or betraying others. To ensure the safety of the group and the success of each escape, Harriet Tubman carried a pistol, and it was famously not used primarily for defense against slave catchers. No, instead, it served as a deterrent against potential traitors who may endanger the entire mission by turning back or by informing slave owners or slave catchers. That pistol was her stern warning: move forward or face the pistol. And that stern warning became legendary as it underscored the gravity of her missions. Beyond her pivotal role in the Underground Railroad, Harriet Tubman played a significant and historically pivotal role during the American Civil War. Serving the Union Army as a scout, spy, nurse, and even military leader, Tubman leveraged her deep knowledge of terrain, spiritual insight, and survival skills. Her role as a scout involved navigating hostile territories, relying heavily on visions and dreams to guide her movements and decisions. Tubman's prophetic visions, a core element of her hoodoo and conjure work, often revealed enemy plans and locations, giving the Union Army an advantage that conventional intelligence gathering could not match. And basically, this is the advantage of having someone who is deeply ingrained and knowledgeable about hoodoo, because as I explained before, the difference between hoodoo and other magical practices is the power source. Like, for example, if someone were to be a pagan and they were to pray to the god Apollo from the Greek pantheon for a really sunny day, or to cast some kind of ritual to make the sun come up, or to engage in some kind of ritual to promote sunshine, then the Greek god Apollo would be the power source of that spell or ritual. However, in hoodoo, everything that is done that is magical in nature comes from the strength and spiritual power of the ancestors. And so since many of the ancestors and people within our lineage would have had their spiritual essence tied to slavery, particularly in areas that were Confederate controlled, well, that only meant that the hoodoo power and her premonitions would have been stronger. The Union Army had a secret weapon that the Confederate Army could not match unless they used another hoodoo conjure woman or a root doctor. Tubman's effectiveness during the war was deeply augmented by her spiritual and mystical insight as a hoodoo conjure woman. Her reputation for prophetic visions and uncanny insights grew so widely respected that even white Union soldiers steeped in racial prejudice found themselves heeding her counsel. Despite widespread racism and systemic disregard often directed towards black women and black people in general, Harriet's advice was repeatedly validated through tangible results. Historically, even those harboring deep-seated racism recognized the authority of a black conjure woman and her spiritual knowledge, and they quietly sought out their guidance despite societal contempt. In her capacity as a spy, Tubman successfully infiltrated enemy lines and gathered critical intelligence, relying heavily on her conjure woman mindset and her ancestral practices. Her methods included employing disguises, spiritual charms, and powerful intuition. Her premonitions allowed her to anticipate threats and movements, making her invaluable as a spy. The commanders of the Union Army soon recognized that Harriet's insights, driven by her mystical practices and visionary guidance, were more accurate and reliable than traditional espionage techniques. One of Harriet Tubman's most remarkable wartime achievements was her leadership in the Combahee River Raid of 1863. Under Colonel James Montgomery, Tubman guided Union troops up the Combahee River in South Carolina, targeting strategic Confederate supply routes. Tubman's profound spiritual insights and astrological timing played key roles, ensuring the raid took place at the most opportune moment for success. The mission marked her as the first woman in American history to plan and lead a military operation, successfully liberating hundreds of enslaved men, women, and children, and also severely disrupting Confederate resources and boosting morale among the enslaved populations. Historically, mystics, conjurers, and wizards, or individuals who had access to the spirit realms, were highly valued advisors to both rulers and generals for their wisdom and their foresight. Modern storytelling, particularly in video games, frequently portrays the mage or wizard archetype with exceptional intelligence and strategic acumen, and that was usually to compensate for physical vulnerabilities. Harriet Tubman exemplified this archetype vividly. Her disability and chronic pain left her physically vulnerable, and yet her hoodoo-driven wisdom and premonitions made her strategically indispensable and dangerous to adversaries, surpassing conventional weapons in effectiveness. Chapter 4: Correcting the Record. There are many people that I did not mention in this deep dive about Harriet Tubman because it is not focused so much on the historical events and more so on hoodoo and conjure and the occult. People such as John Brown and Mary Ellen Pleasant will get their own separate video, and I'll even go into more detail about what I think hoodoo actually is in terms of it being an earthbound based ancestral spirit magic, whereas black freedmen can harness the power of poltergeist activity or most anything a ghost can do, which if you look through several resources you will find that a ghost can do a lot, or a spirit if you will. But there's several things about Harriet Tubman that you may find interesting, like for example, after the Combahee River raid in South Carolina, the black troops didn't even receive medical care. The field hospitals were segregated, and so the black soldiers who were injured didn't even get medical care. Do you know who gave them care with her conjure woman root work? It was Harriet Tubman, because she didn't turn her back on her brothers and sisters in arms. Oh no, just like a real black American freedman and just like a real conjure woman, she didn't turn nobody behind. In fact, there were white soldiers who preferred her medical care over everybody else, which is a very, very common thing if you look at the history of root doctors in the United States. After the war, she was never compensated for her services. And for about 30 years, Harriet Tubman fought for compensation from the US government, and she would also push for the US government to treat every service member with respect and to compensate them should they be wounded, which means that before the Department of Veterans Affairs even existed, Harriet Tubman was fighting a battle on behalf of all wounded veterans. Aside from that, she was also vocal in the suffrage movement, where she realized that being a woman also meant additional setbacks. But Harriet Tubman, like so many other black women, found that white women were not exactly allies a lot of the time, and that what white women such as Susan B. Anthony and so many others wanted was just white supremacy. Because over time, Harriet Tubman and so many others pointed out the fact that white feminism was synonymous with white supremacy, because it put so much focus on white women and their struggles, as if any white woman has a comparable struggle to Harriet Tubman. And what makes this even more interesting is that, unlike white women, Harriet Tubman and her people didn't enslave people. And so you had white women who were slave owners who thought that they were actually being oppressed. The other thing about Harriet Tubman that you may find very fascinating was the fact that some people seem to think that she was unaware of magic, or that she was unaware of otherworldly influences or forces. And not only was that not true, but even her father, Benjamin Ross, was said to have some hoodoo power and also the ability to have premonitions, and specifically he could predict the weather. And so this idea that black people never utilized the occult or were completely unaware of magic and we were all just Christian is not only historically inaccurate, but is flat out insulting. Tarot card readings are very popular among black Americans. And in fact, other magical practices such as voodoo is very popular among various black communities across the African diaspora. And even when you look at the belief in the African gods such as the Orisha, well, you have whole products that you can purchase right now like Ogun juice, which celebrate the African Yoruba traditions and their deities. Many black Americans may be shocked to hear this, but us not believing in the occult, magic, spirits, demons, angels, and other supernatural entities and phenomena is a relatively new thing. If you look back into the beliefs of the enslaved, you will find beliefs in the African gods such as Anansi, Oshun, Shango, Ogun, Obatola, and so many others. Our ancestors in Black America not only had these beliefs, but they live by them. Many of them would predict the future by reading the bones, which is a very, very common thing in Black America. And many Black Americans don't realize where some of our popular sayings come from. Because when you look at a pair of dice, right? And if you were to take those dice and play a game of dice, or if you were to roll them bones, that is a suggestion where you can manipulate probability. And that literally comes from the practice of hoodoo conjure workers using bones and dirt to perform a scrying ritual. And to scry is to look into the future or to see things that you couldn't possibly see on your own. We know that researchers have gone into the childhood home of Harriet Tubman, and they found all types of relics that point to the occult, witchcraft, mysticism, hoodoo, and other magical practices. It was common. The root doctor had to work from scratch as there was no medical care for slaves. And so the root doctor was a product of generations of trial and error. And the fact that you even have any Black Americans that still exist, well, that is the proof that our hoodoo conjure work actually works. And all of that has everything to do with Harriet Tubman and why she was so effective, because her head injury would have been fatal to a lot of people, but her mother's root work is what kept her alive. And not only that, in hoodoo, ancestral and familial connections are strongly emphasized. And so that's what allowed Harriet Tubman to survive for so long, as she held on to the memories of her father, her brothers, her sisters, and her mother as they were being moved around, so that her father, Benjamin Ross, could not protect them. Because even if he could see the future, that didn't necessarily mean he could stop the future. And Harriet Tubman's sacrifice to save another enslaved person and her getting injured as a result of that demonstrates the spirit and the cry for justice that the world has seen all too often from Black American freedmen, as many people around the world see us as a moral authority. And that is despite all the racism and the lies told about Black American freedmen and our hoodoo. There's another misconception about Harriet Tubman that I want to clear up, and that is about her disability. In hoodoo, we do not reject Black American freedmen just because they have a disability. In fact, we tend to elevate that person and protect them, because in Black American freedmen culture, nobody gets left behind. And so whenever you have someone like Harriet Tubman who saves a lot of us and who puts herself in danger on behalf of people whose names she probably didn't even know, then that represents the best of us. But just like Harriet, and as you're gonna see in this Legends of Hoodoo series, she might have been the best of us, but she was far from the only one. In closing, I want to say that I did this video because I saw this nonsense that Harriet Tubman wasn't even a real person, and I got so insulted that I spent 3 weeks to make this video, and it pissed me off so profusely that you had Black people, especially a Black woman, saying this nonsense. Harriet Tubman is a hero, and in my opinion, the best American we ever had. How dare anyone, and especially a Black person, disparage her memory? She deserves more than that, because she paid the cost, and that cost was being in constant danger, having her life threatened, being injured, having to be a disabled woman and have so many people rely on her day after day, going and checking on people. And she exemplified being selfless. And the last thing that I want to say about Harriet Tubman, well, I should say, the last thing that I want to say to Harriet Tubman is thank you.
A-C-A-B, don't you step to M-E. I run to your sundown towns, then turn them upside down. But some of y'all monsters like Stranger Things in the upside down. No surrender, no retreat, certified soldier. Got receipts, you can't walk with my feet. I pack nothing but steel for the heat. I'm not soft, I'm elite. Play my anthem on repeat, now sing it with me. A-C-A-B, hating is just weak. Get off my meat, go take a seat. Came from nothing, now I'm something. Descendant of slaves, enemy slave. It's just how I was raised. Black power, temperature raised. Beautiful yet bloody days. That's why I can't be tamed. None of it was ever a game. A-C-A-B, don't step to me. Ancestral power through me. Big dog, big man, big money. Now feel the teeth.